indigenous to filthy surroundings. Maycomb's Yules lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat, so only its general shape suggested its original design. Square, with 4 tiny rooms opening onto a shotgun hall, the cabin rested uneasily upon 4 irregular lumps of limestone. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summer-time were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the varmints that feasted on Maycomb's refuse. The varmints had a lean time of it, for the Yules gave the dump a thorough gleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs, broomsticks, and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammerheads, snaggle-toothed rakeheads, shovels, axes, and grubbing hoes, held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist's chair, an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars, under which scrawny orange chickens pecked hopefully. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson, had Miss Maudie deigned to permit a geranium on her premises. People said they were Mayella Yules. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. Nobody had occasion to pass by, except at Christmas, when the churches delivered baskets, and when the mayor of Maycomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own trees and trash. Atticus took us with him last Christmas, when he complied with the mayor's request. A dirt road ran from the highway past the dump, down to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond the Yules. It was necessary either to back out to the highway or go the full length of the road and turn around. Most people turned around in the Negroes' front yards. In the frosty December dusk, their cabins looked neat and snug, with pale blue smoke rising from the chimneys, and doorways glowing amber from the fires inside. There were delicious smells about: chicken, bacon frying crisp as the twilight air. Jem and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit, aromas that vanished when we rode back past the Yule residence. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbors was that if scrubbed with lye soap in very hot water, his skin was white. "Mr. Robert Yule?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "That's my name, Cap'n," said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I've heard that lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in court in the heat of argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemies of their parents. They suffer agonies, and are surprised to see them often go out arm in arm with their tormentors during the first recess. This was not true of Jem and me. We acquired no traumas from watching our father win or lose. I'm sorry that I can't provide any drama in this respect. If I did, it would not be true. We could tell, however, when debate became more acrimonious than professional. But this was from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except to a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmer was doing his job as Atticus was doing his. Besides, Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmer's witness, and he had no business being rude to him of all people. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" was the next question. "Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead," was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in his swivel chair and looked benignly at the witness. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" he asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. "This the first time you've ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here." At the witness's affirmative nod, he continued, "Well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand?" Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, "All right, Mr. Gilmer." "Thank you, sir." "Mr. Ewell, would you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the evening of November 21st, please?" Jem grinned and pushed his hair back. "Just in your own words" was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid his witness might employ. "Well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house." Here Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness, and must have decided his speculations devoid of evil intent, for he subsided sleepily. "What time was it, Mr. Ewell?" "Just 'fore sundown." "Well, I was saying, Mayella was screaming fit to beat Jesus." Another glance from the bench silenced Mr. Ewell. "Yes, she was screaming?" said Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell looked confusedly at the judge. "Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and run as fast as I could, but I run into the fence. But when I got disentangled, I run up to the window, and I seen—" Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. "I seen that black nigger yonder ruttin' on my Mayella!" So serene was Judge Taylor's court that he had few occasions to use his gavel, but he hammered fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench, saying something to him. Mr. Heck Tate, as first officer of the county, stood in the middle aisle, quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me, pulling at Jem's elbow. "Mr. Jem," he said, "you better take Miss Jean Louise home. Mr. Jem, you hear me?" Jem turned his head. "Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home." "You gotta make me first," I said, remembering Atticus's blessed dictum. Jem scowled furiously at me, then said to Reverend Sykes, "I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it." I was mortally offended. "I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can." "Oh, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet." Reverend Sykes's black eyes were anxious. "Mr. Finch know you all are here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise, or you boys either." Jem shook his head. "He can't see us this far away. "It's all right, Reverend." I knew Jem would win, because I knew nothing could make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while. Atticus could see us from where he was, if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Yule was sitting smugly in the witness chair, surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps, lessening in intensity, until the only sound in the courtroom was a dim pink, pink, pink. The judge might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing, and I thought about what Atticus had said. He and Mrs. Taylor didn't kiss much. He must have been nearly 70. "There has been a request," Judge Taylor said, "that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, or at least of women and children. A request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for, and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling lot of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Yule, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that is possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer." Mr. Yule reminded me of a deaf mute. I was sure he had never heard the words Judge Taylor directed at him. His mouth struggled silently with them, but their import registered on his face. Smugness faded from it, replaced by a dogged earnestness that fooled Judge Taylor not at all. As long as Mr. Yule was on the stand, the judge kept his eyes on him, as if daring him to make a false move. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again. His fist rested on his cheek, and we could not see his face. Mr. Gilmer looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. "Mr. Yule, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter?" "Yes, I did." The spectators were quiet, but the defendant said something. Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. "You say you were at the window?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "Yes, sir." "How far is it from the ground?" "About 3 foot." "Did you have a clear view of the room?" "Yes, sir." "How did the room look?" "Well, it was all slung about, like there was a fight." "What did you do when you saw the defendant?" "Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who he was, all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor, squalling." "Then what did you do?" "Why, I run for Tate, quick as I could. I knowed who it was, all right. Lived down yonder in that nigger nest, past the house every day." "Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, sides devaluing my property." "Thank you, Mr. Yule," said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. "Just a minute, sir," said Atticus genially. "Could I ask you a question or two?" Mr. Yule backed up into the witness chair, settled himself, and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion, an expression common to Maycomb County witnesses when confronted by opposing counsel. "Mr. Ewell," Atticus began, "folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor?" "Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened." "But there's one thing I don't understand," said Atticus. "Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition?" "I most positively was," said Mr. Ewell. "I seen who done it." "No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention?" "What?" "Didn't you think she should have had a doctor immediately?" The witness said he never thought of it. He had never called a doctor to any of his'n in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. "That all?" he asked. "Not quite," said Atticus casually. "Mr. Ewell, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you?" "How's that?" "You were in the courtroom when Mr. Heck Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you?" Mr. Ewell considered the matter carefully, and seemed to decide that the question was safe. "Yes," he said. "Do you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries?" "How's that?" Atticus looked around at Mr. Gilmer and smiled. Mr. Ewell seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. "Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten around the—" "Oh, yeah," said the witness. "I hold with everything Tate said." "You do?" asked Atticus mildly. "I just want to make sure." He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for some minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it were stock market quotations. "Which eye her left? Oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now, she was bunged." He flipped the page. "Up on that side of the face. Sheriff, please repeat what you said." "It was her right eye, I said." "Thank you, Bert," said Atticus. "You heard it again, Mr. Ewell. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff?" "I holds with Tate. Her eye was blacked, and she was mighty beat up." The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus an easy match. He seemed to grow ruddy again. His chest swelled, and once more he was a red little rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. "Mr. Ewell, can you read and write?" Mr. Gilmer interrupted. "Objection," he said. "Can't see what witness's literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial." Judge Taylor was about to speak, but Atticus said, "Judge, if you'll allow the question, plus another one, you'll soon see." "All right, let's see," said Judge Taylor. "But make sure we see, Atticus." "Overruled." Mr. Gilmer seemed as curious as the rest of us as to what bearing the state of Mr. Ewell's education had on the case. "I'll repeat the question," said Atticus. "Can you read and write?" "I most positively can." "Will you write your name and show us?" "I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks?" Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he had gone frog-sticking without a light. Never, 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 on cross-examination, ask a witness a question you don't already know the answer to, was a tenet I absorbed with my baby food. Do it, and you'll often get an answer you don't want, an answer that might wreck your case. Atticus was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an envelope, then reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely, and had turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen cap and placed it gently on his table. He shook the pen a little, then handed it, with the envelope, to the witness. "Would you write your name for us?" he asked. "Clearly now, so the jury can see you do it." Mr. Ewell wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he was some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand, to see Mr. Gilmer half sitting, half standing at his table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. "What's so interesting?" he asked. "You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell," said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a Christ-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Tricking lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of him all the time with their tricking ways. He had told them what happened. He'd say it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story, that he had looked through the window, then ran the nigger off, then ran for the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. "About your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell?" "I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other. One hand good as the other," he added, glaring at the defense table. Jem seemed to be having a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony rails softly, and once he whispered, "We've got him." I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Ewell could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was blacked, and she was beaten mostly on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Sherlock Holmes and Jem Finch would agree, but Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Heck Tate, I imagined a person facing me, went through a swift mental pantomime, and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked down at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulders and bull-thick neck. He could easily have done it. I thought Jem was counting his chickens. Chapter 18. But someone was booming again, "Mayella Violet Ewell!" A young girl walked to the witness stand. As she raised her hand and swore that the evidence she gave would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help her God, she seemed somehow fragile-looking. But when she sat facing us in the witness chair, she became what she was, a thick-bodied girl accustomed to strenuous labor. In Macomb County, it was easy to tell when someone bathed regularly, as opposed to yearly lavations. Mr. Ewell had a scalded look, as if an overnight soaking had deprived him of protective layers of dirt. His skin appeared to be sensitive to the elements. Mayella looked as if she tried to keep clean, and I was reminded of the row of red geraniums in the Ewell yard. Mr. Gilmer asked Mayella to tell the jury, in her own words, what happened on the evening of November 21st of last year. Just in her own words, please." Mayella sat silently. "Where were you at dusk on that evening?" began Mr. Gilmer patiently. "On the porch." "Which porch?" "Ain't but one. The front porch." "What were you doing on the porch?" "Nothing." Judge Taylor said, "Just tell us what happened. You can do that, can't you?" Mayella stared at him and burst into tears. She covered her mouth with her hands and sobbed. Judge Taylor let her cry for a while. Then he said, "That's enough now. Don't be afraid of anybody here, as long as you tell the truth. All this is strange to you, I know, but you've nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to fear. What are you scared of?" Mayella said something behind her hands. "What was that?" asked the judge. "Him," she sobbed, pointing at Atticus. "Mr. Finch?" She nodded vigorously, saying, "Don't want him doing me like he done Papa, trying to make him out left-handed." Judge Taylor scratched his thick white hair. It was plain that he had never been confronted with a problem of this kind. "How old are you?" he asked. 19 and a half, Mayella said. Judge Taylor cleared his throat and tried unsuccessfully to speak in soothing tones. "Mr. Finch has no idea of scaring you," he growled, "and if he did, I'm here to stop him. That's one thing I'm sitting up here for. Now you're a big girl, so you just sit up straight and tell us what happened to you. You can do that, can't you?" I whispered to Jem, "Has she got good sense?" Jem was squinting down at the witness stand. "Can't tell yet," he said. "She's got enough sense to get the judge sorry for her, but she might be I don't know." Mollified, Mayella gave Atticus a final, terrified glance, and said to Mr. Gilmer, "Well, sir, I was on the porch, and he came along, and, you see, there was this old shiffer-robe in the yard Papa brought in to chop up for kindling. Papa told me to do it while he was off in the woods, but I wasn't feeling strong enough then. So he came by." "Who is he?" Mayella pointed to Tom Robinson. "I'll have to ask you to be more specific, please," said Mr. Gilmer. "The reporter can't put down gestures very well." "That and yonder," she said. "Robinson." "Then what happened?" "I said, 'Come here, nigger, and bust up this shiffer-robe for me. I got a nickel for you.' He could have done it easy enough, he could. So he come in the yard, and I went in the house to get him the nickel, and I turned around, and 'fore I knew it he was on me. Just run up behind me, he did. He got me round the neck, cussing me, and saying dirt. I fought and hollered, but he had me round the neck. He hit me again and again." Mr. Gilmer waited for Mayella to collect herself. She had twisted her handkerchief into a sweaty rope. When she opened it to wipe her face, it was a mass of creases from her hot hands. She waited for Mr. Gilmer to ask another question, but when he didn't, she said, "He chunked me on the floor, and choked me and took advantage of me." "Did you scream?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "Did you scream and fight back?" "Reckon I did. Hollered for all I was worth. Kicked and hollered loud as I could." "Then what happened?" "I don't remember too good, but next thing I knew, Papa was in the room a-standing over me, hollering, 'Who done it? Who done it?' Then I sort of fainted,
and the next thing I knew, Mr. Tate was pulling me up off of the floor and leading me to the water bucket.
Apparently Mayella's recital had given her confidence, but it was not her father's brash kind. There was something stealthy about hers, like a steady-eyed cat with a twitchy tail. "You say you fought him off as hard as you could? Fought him tooth and nail?" asked Mr. Gilmer.
"I positively did,"
Mayella echoed her father. "You are positive that he took full advantage of you?" Mayella's face contorted, and I was afraid that she would cry again. Instead she said,
"He done what he was after."
Mr. Gilmer called attention to the hot day by wiping his head with his hand. "That's all for the time being," he said pleasantly, "but you stay there. I expect big bad Mr. Finch has some questions to ask you." "State will not prejudice the witness against counsel for the defense," murmured Judge Taylor primly. "At least not at this time." Atticus got up grinning, but instead of walking to the witness stand, he opened his coat and hooked his thumbs in his vest. Then he walked slowly across the room to the windows. He looked out, but didn't seem especially interested in what he saw. Then he turned and strolled back to the witness stand. From long years of experience, I could tell he was trying to come to a decision about something. "Miss Mayella," he said, smiling, "I won't try to scare you for a while, not yet. Let's just get acquainted. How old are you?"
"Said I was 19. Said it to the judge yonder."
Mayella jerked her head resentfully at the bench. "So you did. So you did, ma'am. You'll have to bear with me, Miss Mayella. I'm getting along and can't remember as well as I used to. I might ask you things you've already said before, but you'll give me an answer, won't you? Good." I could see nothing in Mayella's expression to justify Atticus's assumption that he had secured her wholehearted cooperation. She was looking at him furiously.
"Won't answer a word you say, long as you keep on mocking me," she said.
"Ma'am?" said Atticus, startled.
"Long as you keep on making fun of me."
Judge Taylor said, "Mr. Finch is not making fun of you. What's the matter with you?" Mayella looked from under lowered eyelids at Atticus, but she said to the judge,
"Long as he keeps on calling me ma'am and saying Miss Mayella, I don't have to take his sass. I ain't called upon to take it."
Atticus resumed his stroll to the windows and let Judge Taylor handle this one. Judge Taylor was not the kind of figure that ever evoked pity, but I did feel a pang for him as he tried to explain. "That's just Mr. Finch's way," he told Mayella. "We've done business in this court for years and years, and Mr. Finch is always courteous to everybody. He's not trying to mock you. He's trying to be polite. That's just his way." The judge leaned back. "Atticus, let's get on with these proceedings, and let the record show that the witness has not been sassed. Her views to the contrary." I wondered if anybody had ever called her ma'am or Miss Mayella in her life. Probably not, as she took offense to routine courtesy. What on earth was her life like? I soon found out. "You say you're 19, Atticus resumed. "How many sisters and brothers have you?" He walked from the windows back to the stand. "7, she said, and I wondered if they were all like the specimen I had seen the first day I started to school. "You the eldest? The oldest?" "Yes." "How long has your mother been dead?" "Don't know. Long time."
Did you ever go to school?"
"Readin' right good as Papa yonder."
Mayella sounded like a Mr. Jingle in a book I had been reading. "How long did you go to school?"
2 year. 3 year. Dunno.
Slowly but surely I began to see the pattern of Atticus's questions. From questions that Mr. Gilmer did not deem sufficiently irrelevant or immaterial to object to, Atticus was quietly building up before the jury a picture of the Ewells' home life. The jury learned the following things. Their relief check was far from enough to feed the family, and there was strong suspicion that Papa drank it up anyway. He sometimes went off in the swamp for days and came home sick. The weather was seldom cold enough to require shoes, but when it was, you could make dandy ones from strips of old tires. The family hauled its water in buckets from a spring that ran out at one end of the dump. They kept the surrounding area clear of trash, and it was everybody for himself as far as keeping clean went. If you wanted to wash, you hauled your own water. The younger children had perpetual colds and suffered from chronic ground itch. There was a lady who came around sometimes and asked Mayella why she didn't stay in school. She wrote down the answer. With 2 members of the family reading and writing, there was no need for the rest of them to learn. Papa needed them at home. "Miss Mayella," said Atticus in spite of himself, "a 19-year-old girl like you must have friends. Who are your friends?" The witness frowned as if puzzled. "Friends?" "Yes. Don't you know anyone near your age, or older, or younger? Boys and girls? Just ordinary friends?" Mayella's hostility, which had subsided to grudging neutrality, flared again. "You making fun of me again, Mr. Finch?" Atticus let her question answer his. "Do you love your father, Miss Mayella?" was his next.
"Love him? What you mean?"
"I mean, is he good to you? Is he easy to get along with?"
"He does tolerable, 'cept when—"
"Except when?"
Mayella looked at her father, who was sitting with his chair tipped against the railing. He sat up straight and waited for her to answer. "Except when nothing," said Mayella. "I said he does tolerable." Mr. Ewell leaned back again.
"Except when he's drinking?" asked Atticus so gently that Mayella nodded. "Does he ever go after you?"
"How you mean?"
"When he's riled. Has he ever beaten you?" Mayella looked around, down at the court reporter, up at the judge. "Answer the question, Miss Mayella," said Judge Taylor.
"My pa's never touched a hair on my head in my life," she declared firmly. "He never touched me."
Atticus's glasses had slipped a little, and he pushed them up on his nose. "We've had a good visit, Miss Mayella, and now I guess we'd better get to the case. You say you asked Tom Robinson to come chop up what was it? A shifer rope? A whole dresser full of drawers on one side. Was Tom Robinson well known to you?"
"What do you mean?"
"I mean, did you know who he was? Where he lived?"
Mayella nodded. "I knowed who he was. He passed the house every day."
"Was this the first time you asked him to come inside the fence?" Mayella jumped slightly at the question. Atticus was making his slow pilgrimage to the windows, as he had been doing. He would ask a question, then look out, waiting for an answer. He did not see her involuntary jump, but it seemed to me that he knew she had moved. He turned around and raised his eyebrows. He began again. Yes, it was. Didn't you ever ask him to come inside the fence before? She was prepared now. I did not. I certainly did not. One did not's enough, said Atticus serenely. You never asked him to do odd jobs for you before? I mighta, conceded Mayella. There was several niggers around. Can you remember any other occasions? No. All right. Now to what happened. You said Tom Robinson was behind you in the room when you turned around. That right? Yes. You said he got you around the neck, cussing and saying dirt. Is that right? That's right. Atticus's memory had suddenly become accurate. You say he caught me and choked me and took advantage of me. Is that right? That's what I said. Do you remember him beating you about the face? The witness hesitated. You seem sure enough that he choked you. All this time you were fighting back, remember? You kicked and hollered as loud as you could. Do you remember him beating you about the face? Mayella was silent. She seemed to be trying to get something clear to herself. I thought for a moment she was doing Mr. Hectate's and my trick of pretending there was a person in front of us. She glanced at Mr. Gilmer. It's an easy question, Miss Mayella, so I'll try again. Do you remember him beating you about the face? Atticus's voice had lost its comfortableness. He was speaking in his arid, detached, professional voice. Do you remember him beating you about the face? No, I don't recollect if he hit me. Yes, I do. He hit me. Was your last sentence your answer? Huh? Yes, he hit. I just don't remember. It all happened so quick. Judge Taylor looked sternly at Mayella. Don't you cry, young woman, he began, but Atticus said, Let her cry if she wants to, Judge. We've got all the time in the world. Mayella sniffed wrathfully and looked at Atticus. I'll answer any question you got. Get me up here and mock me, will you? I'll answer any question you got. That's fine, said Atticus. There are only a few more. Miss Mayella, not to be tedious, you've testified that the defendant hit you, grabbed you around the neck, choked you, and took advantage of you. I want you to be sure you have the right man. Will you identify the man who raped you? I will. That's him, right yonder. Atticus turned to the defendant. Tom, stand up. Let Miss Mayella have a good long look at you. Is this the man, Miss Mayella? Tom Robinson's powerful shoulders rippled under his thin shirt. He rose to his feet and stood with his right hand on the back of his chair. He looked oddly off balance, but it was not from the way he was standing. His left arm was fully 12 inches shorter than his right, and hung dead at his side. It ended in a small, shriveled hand, and from as far away as the balcony I could see that it was no use to him. "Scout," breathed Jem. "Scout, look! Reverend, he's crippled." Reverend Sykes leaned across me and whispered to Jem, "He got it caught in a cotton gin. Caught it in Mr. Dolphus Raymond's cotton gin when he was a boy. Like to bled to death. Tore all the muscles loose from his bones." Atticus said, "Is this the man who raped you?" "It most certainly is." Atticus's next question was one word long. "How?" Mayella was raging. I don't know how he done it, but he done it. I said it all happened so fast,
Now, let's consider this calmly, began Atticus, but Mr. Gilmer interrupted with an objection. He was not irrelevant or immaterial, but Atticus was browbeating the witness. Judge Taylor laughed outright. "Oh, sit down, Horace. He's doing nothing of the sort. If anything, the witness is browbeating Atticus." Judge Taylor was the only person in the courtroom who laughed. Even the babies were still, and I suddenly wondered if they had been smothered at their mother's breasts.
This ends Disc 7. To Kill a Mockingbird, Disc 8.
"Now," said Atticus, "Miss Mayella, you testified that the defendant choked and beat you. You didn't say that he sneaked up behind you and knocked you cold, but you turned around, and there he was." Atticus was back behind his table, and he emphasized his words by rapping his knuckles on it. "Do you wish to reconsider any of your testimony?"
You want me to say something that didn't happen?
"No, ma'am. I want you to say something that did happen. Tell us once more, please, what happened."
I told you what happened.
"You testified that you turned around and there he was. He choked you then?"
Yes.
"Then he released your throat and hit you?"
I said he did.
"He blacked your right eye with his right fist?"
I ducked, and it glanced. That's what it did. I ducked, and it glanced off.
Mayella had finally seen the light. "You're becoming suddenly clear on this point. A while ago you couldn't remember too well, could you?"
I said he hit me.
"All right. He choked you, he hit you, then he raped you. That right?"
It most certainly is.
"You're a strong girl. What were you doing all the time? Just standing there?"
I told you I hollered and kicked and fought.
Atticus reached up and took off his glasses, turned his good right eye to the witness, and rained questions on her. Judge Taylor said, "One question at a time, Atticus. Give the witness a chance to answer." "All right. Why didn't you run?"
I tried to.
"Tried to? What kept you from it?"
He slung me down. That's what he did. He slung me down and got on top of me.
"You were screaming all this time?"
I certainly was.
"Then why didn't the other children hear you? Where were they? At the dump?" No answer. "Where were they? Why didn't your screams make them come running? The dump's closer than the woods, isn't it?" No answer. "Or didn't you scream until you saw your father in the window? You didn't think to scream until then, did you?" No answer. "Did you scream first at your father instead of at Tom Robinson? Was that it?" No answer. "Who beat you up? Tom Robinson or your father?" No answer. "What did your father see in the window? The crime of rape, or the best defense to it? Why don't you tell the truth, child? Didn't Bob Ewell beat you up?" When Atticus turned away from Mayella, he looked like his stomach hurt. But Mayella's face was a mixture of terror and fury. Atticus sat down wearily and polished his glasses with his handkerchief. Suddenly Mayella became articulate.
I got something to say, she said.
Atticus raised his head. "Do you want to tell us what happened?" But she did not hear the compassion in his invitation.
I got something to say, and then I ain't gonna say no more. That nigger yonder took advantage of me, and if you fine fancy gentlemen don't want to do nothing about it, then you're all yellow stinking cowards. Stinking cowards, the lot of you. Your fancy airs don't come to nothing. Your mamming and Miss Mayellaring don't come to nothing, Mr. Finch." Then she burst into real tears. Her shoulders shook with angry sobs. She was as good as her word. She answered no more questions, even when Mr. Gilmer tried to get her back on the track. I guess if she hadn't been so poor and ignorant, Judge Taylor would have put her under the jail for the contempt she had shown everybody in the courtroom. Somehow Atticus had hit her hard in a way that was not clear to me, but it gave him no pleasure to do so. He sat with his head down, and I never saw anybody glare at anyone with the hatred Mayella showed when she left the stand and walked by Atticus's table. When Mr. Gilmer told Judge Taylor that the state rested, Judge Taylor said, "It's time we all did. We'll take 10 minutes. Atticus and Mr. Gilmer met in front of the bench and whispered. Then they left the courtroom by a door behind the witness stand, which was a signal for us all to stretch. I discovered that I had been sitting on the edge of the long bench, and I was somewhat numb. Jem got up and yawned. Dill did likewise, and Reverend Sykes wiped his face on his hat. The temperature was an easy 90, he said. Mr. Braxton Underwood, who had been sitting quietly in a chair reserved for the press, soaking up testimony with his sponge of a brain, allowed his bitter eyes to rove over the colored balcony, and they met mine. He gave a snort and looked away. "Jem," I said, "Mr. Underwood's seen us." "That's okay. He won't tell Atticus. He'll just put it on the social side of the Tribune." Jem turned back to Dill, explaining, I suppose, the finer points of the trial to him, but I wondered what they were. There had been no lengthy debates between Atticus and Mr. Gilmer on any points. Mr. Gilmer seemed to be prosecuting almost reluctantly. Witnesses had been led by the nose as asses are, with few objections. But Atticus had once told us that in Judge Taylor's court, any lawyer who was a strict constructionist on evidence usually wound up receiving strict instructions from the bench. He distilled this for me to mean that Judge Taylor might look lazy and operate in his sleep, but he was seldom reversed, and that was the proof of the pudding. Atticus said he was a good judge. Presently Judge Taylor returned and climbed into his swivel chair. He took a cigar from his vest pocket and examined it thoughtfully. I punched Dill. Having passed the judge's inspection, the cigar suffered a vicious bite. "We come down sometimes to watch him," I explained. "It's going to take him the rest of the afternoon now. You watch." Unaware of public scrutiny from above, Judge Taylor disposed of the severed end by propelling it expertly to his lips and saying, "Floop." He hit a spittoon so squarely we could hear it slosh. "Bet he was hell with a spitball," murmured Dill. As a rule, a recess meant a general exodus, but today people weren't moving. Even the idlers who had failed to shame younger men from their seats had remained standing along the walls. I guess Mr. Heck Tate had reserved the county toilet for court officials. Atticus and Mr. Gilmer returned, and Judge Taylor looked at his watch. "It's getting on to 4, he said, which was intriguing, as the courthouse clock must have struck the hour at least twice. I had not heard it, or felt its vibrations. "Shall we try to wind up this afternoon?" asked Judge Taylor. "How about it, Atticus?" "I think we can," said Atticus. "How many witnesses you got?" 1. Well, call him. Chapter 19. Thomas Robinson reached around, ran his fingers under his left arm, and lifted it. He guided his arm to the Bible, and his rubber-like left hand sought contact with the black binding. As he raised his right hand, the useless one slipped off the Bible and hit the clerk's table. He was trying again when Judge Taylor growled, "That'll do, Tom." Tom took the oath and stepped into the witness chair. Atticus very quickly induced him to tell us. Tom was 25 years of age. He was married with 3 children. He had been in trouble with the law before. He once received 30 days for disorderly conduct. "It must have been disorderly," said Atticus. "What did it consist of?" "Got in a fight with another man. He tried to cut me." "Did he succeed?" "Yes, sir. A little. Not enough to hurt. You see, Tom moved his left shoulder. "Yes," said Atticus. "You were both convicted?" "Yes, sir. I had to serve 'cause I couldn't pay the fine. Other feller paid his'n." Dill leaned across me and asked Jem what Atticus was doing. Jem said Atticus was showing the jury that Tom had nothing to hide. "Were you acquainted with Mayella Violet Ewell?" asked Atticus. "Yes, sir. I had to pass her place going to and from the field every day." "Whose field?" "I picks for Mr. Link Diaz." "Were you picking cotton in November?" "No, sir. I works in his yard fall and winter time. I works pretty steady for him all year round. He's got a lot of pecan trees and things." "You say you had to pass the Ewell place to get to and from work. Is there any other way to go?" "No, sir. None's I know of." "Tom, did she ever speak to you?" "Why, yes, sir. I'd tip my hat when I'd go by, and one day she asked me to come inside the fence and bust up a chifforobe for her." "When did she ask you to chop up the chifforobe?" "Mr. Finch, it was way last spring. I remember it because it was chopping time, and I had my hoe with me. I said I didn't have nothing but this hoe, but she said she had a hatchet. She give me the hatchet, and I broke up the chifforobe. She said, 'I reckon I'll have to give you a nickel, won't I?' And I said, 'No, ma'am, there ain't no charge.' Then I went home. Mr. Finch, that was way last spring, way over a year ago." "Did you ever go on the place again?" "Yes, sir." "When?" "Well, I went lots of times." Judge Taylor instinctively reached for his gavel, but let his hand fall. The murmur below us died without his help. "Under what circumstances?" "Please, sir?" "Why did you go inside the fence lots of times?" Tom Robinson's forehead relaxed. "She'd call me in, sir. Seemed like every time I passed by yonder, she'd have some little something for me to do. Chopping kindling, toting water for her. She watered them red flowers every day." "Were you paid for your services?" "No, sir. Not after she offered me a nickel the first time. I was glad to do it. Mr. Ewell didn't seem to help her none, and neither did the children, and I knowed she didn't have no nickels to spare." "Where were the other children?" "They was always around, all over the place. They'd watch me work, some of 'em. Some of 'em 'd set in the window." "Would Miss Mayella talk to you?" "Yes, sir. She talked to me." "Did you ever go on the place again?" "Yes, sir. When I was 16. "Did you ever go on the place again?" "Yes, sir." "What did she say?" "She said I didn't have nothing but this hoe." "Where was the other children?" "They was always around, all over the place. They'd watch me work, some of 'em. Some of 'em 'd set in the window." "Would Miss Mayella talk to you?" "Yes, sir. She talked to me." As Tom Robinson gave his testimony, it came to me that Mayella Ewell must have been the loneliest person in the world. She was even lonelier than Boo Radley, who had not been out of the house in 25 years. When Atticus asked had she any friends, she seemed not to know what he meant. Then she thought he was making fun of her. She was as sad, I thought, as what Jem called a mixed child. White people wouldn't have anything to do with her because she lived among pigs. Negroes wouldn't have anything to do with her because she was white. She couldn't live like Mr. Dolphus Raymond, who preferred the company of Negroes, because she didn't own a riverbank, and she wasn't from a fine old family. Nobody said, "That's just their way," about the Ewells. Maycomb gave them Christmas baskets, welfare money, and the back of its hand. Tom Robinson was probably the only person who was ever decent to her. But she said he took advantage of her, and when she stood up, she looked at him as if he were dirt beneath her feet. "Did you ever," Atticus interrupted my meditations, "at any time go on the Ewell property? Did you ever set foot on the Ewell property without an express invitation from one of them?" "No, sir, Mr. Finch, I never did. I wouldn't do that, sir." Atticus sometimes said that one way to tell whether a witness was lying or telling the truth was to listen rather than watch. I applied his test. Tom denied it 3 times in one breath, but quietly, with no hint of whining in his voice, and I found myself believing him in spite of his protesting too much. He seemed to be a respectable Negro, and a respectable Negro would never go up into somebody's yard of his own volition. "Tom, what happened to you on the evening of November 21st of last year?" Below us, the spectators drew a collective breath and leaned forward. Behind us, the Negroes did the same. Tom was a black velvet Negro, not shiny, but soft black velvet. The whites of his eyes shone in his face, and when he spoke, we saw flashes of his teeth. If he had been whole, he would have been a fine specimen of a man. "Mr. Finch," he said, "I was going home as usual that evening, and when I passed the Ewell place, Miss Mayella were on the porch, like she said she were. It seemed real quiet-like, and I didn't quite know why. I was studying why, just passing by, when she says for me to come there and help her a minute. Well, I went inside the fence and looked around for some kindling. Well,